Welcome everyone to the Social Cybersecurity Working Group meeting under the auspices of South Big Data Hub, sponsored by National Science Foundation. I am Dr. Nitin Agarwal, Malden Energy Chair and Endowed Distinguished Professor of Information Science at UL Little Rock. I'm also the Director for Cosmos Research Center at Arkansas, which stands for Collaboratorium for Social Media and Online Behavioral Studies. And today we have the distinct pleasure to have Professor Stephan Lewandowski with us, who is going to tell us about demagogues, technology, and democracy. And just a little bit about Professor Lewandowski. He's a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol, whose main interest is in the pressure points between the architecture of online information technologies and human cognition, and the consequences of democracy that arise from these pressure points. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award from Australian Research Council, a Wolfson Research Merit Fellowship from the Royal Society, and a Humboldt Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Science, UK, and a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science. He was appointed a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry for his commitment to science, rational inquiry, and public education. He was elected to the Leopoldina, the German National Academy of Sciences, in 2022. Professor Lewandowski also holds a guest professorship at the University of Potsdam in Germany. He was identified as a highly cited researcher in 2022 and 2023 by Clarivate, a distinction that is awarded to fewer than 0.1% of the researchers worldwide. His research examines the consequences of the clash between social media architectures and human cognition. For example, by researching countermeasures to the persistence of misinformation and spread of fake news in society, including conspiracy theories, and how platform algorithms may contribute to the prevalence of misinformation. He's also interested in the variables that determine whether or not people accept scientific evidence, for example, surrounding vaccinations or climate science. He has published hundreds of scholarly articles, chapters, and books, with more than 200 peer-reviewed articles alone since 2000. His research regularly appears in journals such as Nature, Human Behavior, Nature, Communications, and Psychological Review. His research is currently funded by the European Research Council, the EU's Horizon 2020 program, the UK Research Agency, the Volkswagen Foundation, John Templeton Foundation, Google's Jigsaw, and by the Social Sciences Research Council's Mercury Project. Professor Lewandowski also frequently appears in print and broadcast media and has contributed around 100 opinion pieces to the global media. He has been working with policymakers at the European level for many years, and he has first authored of a report on technology and democracy that has helped shape EU digital legislation. And there are many accomplishments. We can go on and on and on. So it is our distinct pleasure to have Professor Lewandowski with us. With that, I turn it over to you, Professor, and please go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much. That's a very kind introduction, and the guy sounds great. I'm going to have to meet him one day. That was really very good, and I'll try to live up to that in my talk today. So yeah, I want to talk about demagogues, technology, and democracy. Why? Why am I interested in that? Well, the departure point from my research is the observation that for the last 10 to 20 years, there are growing indications that democracy is in retreat around the world. Now, what I'm showing you here is a graph from one institution in Sweden that is measuring democracy on an annual basis. And this is a decadal comparison between 2011 and 2021. Now, any point below the diagonal identifies a country that has lost part of its democracy during the last 10 years. Now, the indicator that's being plotted here is a composite of a lot of different measures, you know, the fairness of elections and freedom of speech, freedom of the media, independence of the judiciary, and so on. And as you can see, there's a concerning number of countries below the line, including Central European countries and EU member states, and also including the United States by this measure. So there's a widespread decline of democracy. It's not universal. There are some other countries that are above the diagonal. They're doing better. But there's enough there, I think, for us to be worried. Now, why? Why does this happen? Well, we can discuss this for the next 3 years. There's so much to talk about, and there's so many factors interacting going on. So I can't give you an answer. But what I can do is I can shine a light on one aspect of this phenomenon we're observing, which is the interaction between what I call demagogues, that is, politicians who are misleading the public, our own human cognition, and the architecture of social media. That's sort of the space in which I'm operating. And to foreshadow briefly, what I'm suggesting is that the architecture of social media, as well as the activities of demagogues, are in conflict with our human cognition. When I say in conflict, what I mean by that is that our cognition is not built to withstand the assaults that our intellect may suffer from those two sources. And to make things kind of worse, in a sense, I'm also going to argue that there's an affinity between social media and demagogues, that they can reinforce each other, and that demagogues can rely on social media to spread their messages. Now, that's sort of the big background. The specific question I'm trying to illustrate today is the following conundrum. And I'm now going to illustrate this initially by talking about Donald Trump, simply because he was president and he did make a lot of mistaken and false claims, as is shown here, according to fact checkers, throughout his presidency, while at the same time, his followers considered him to be honest. And this, to me, is a conundrum. How can you have fact checkers on the one hand point to an individual and say, hey, there's a lot of mistakes here, a lot of false claims, a lot of lies, maybe, a lot of misinformation. But his voters say, oh, no, he's honest. Now, there's a lot of different ways in which you can explain that. I'm going to try and explain that by thinking about what it actually means to be honest in the eyes of people. And to introduce what I'm talking about, let me go back to the first day of Donald Trump's presidency, the day of his inauguration, when his press secretary said, well, that was the largest audience ever to attend an inauguration. Well, it wasn't, actually. If you look at these two photos, on the left we have Trump, on the right we have Obama. There's a huge difference in the number of people attending. These photos were taken at the same time by the same people from the same location. So there's no question here. There's no sort of, factual debate. It is simply wrong to make this particular claim. And what's interesting about this claim, and a lot of other claims being made by Donald Trump, and not just him, many others, they're saying things that can be easily disproven, like this inauguration claim. You take one look at the photo, case closed, right? And this is a pervasive attribute of what I call shock and chaos disinformation. The term goes back to two sociologists, McCreight and Dunlap, in 2017. They coined that term. And one of the attributes of shock and chaos disinformation is that the lies are obvious. They can be disproven. They also don't seem to necessarily have specific purpose. If you look at some of the mistaken claims that Donald Trump made, it's kind of like you wonder, what? Why would he be wanting to be wrong about that? Why is he lying about that? And they can be incoherent. The same sources can pump out totally incoherent messages. A prime example of that was the Russian response to the downing of a Malaysian airliner, which they first said was a Ukrainian attack. Then they said the pilot crashed the plane. Then they said that the plane was full of dead bodies on takeoff. And then this goes on. And you kind of wonder what's going on here. And I would argue that what is happening here is that the intent is not to be believed, but for people to get to an intellectual and emotional space where they think nothing can be believed. This, to me, is about the undermining of the concept of truth, that it is possible to get to the bottom of something. That is being undermined. And if you look at the history of the 20th century, then Hannah Arendt, who was one of the most prominent analysts of totalitarianism, a fantastic philosopher who in my opinion, had it spot on 70 years ago. What she's saying is that, the point of lying all the time is not that people believe the lies, but that they believe nothing. And then you can do whatever you want with those people. Those were her words, and I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. So I want to start out exploring this by taking a few paths. The first thing I want to discover is whether or not Donald Trump is unique. In other words, am I just picking on one person who is somehow different? Or is there something more general at work? Well, the answer is Donald Trump is not unique, and we know this from a number of different sources. This paper here, which we published just it's now 15 months, but it seems like yesterday. This paper looked at the tweets of all members of Congress during that time period, 1.6 million tweets. And what we did for this initial analysis was to extract all the links in those tweets and discover how trustworthy the domain was that was being shared by the tweet. So we did not fact check the articles. What we did instead was to consider, this domain, let's say NewYorkTimes.com, how trustworthy is that? And we used something called NewsGuard to investigate this. And NewsGuard is a pretty good, independent measure of quality, and they rely on fairly objective criteria to establish the trustworthiness of a domain. And this is what we find. Our first snapshot of the data. Let me walk you through the graph. Each dot here is a member of Congress, coded by party: blue Democrats, obviously red Republicans. But in addition to party, they're also spread out along their ideology from far left to far right. There are ways in which this can be measured, and we used one of those indicators. Now, below the horizontal line are the people who never ever shared anything that was considered untrustworthy by NewsGuard. And what you can see there is there's a vastly larger number of blue dots than red dots. And what you can also see is that there are some Democrats on the right and some Republicans on the left, and that it's not totally segregated. There's some diffusion between the parties here, but by and large, Democrats are less likely to share bad quality information. Now, above the horizontal line, you have the remaining Congress people who do share bad information as defined by NewsGuard on occasion. This is on a logarithmic scale. And there you can see again that there's a big cluster of red towards the top right that is in fact considerably higher than the Democrats, suggesting that, again, the Democratic Congress people share less poor quality information than their Republican counterparts. And we can express this over time as a proportion of untrustworthy domains being shared. What you can see is that the blue line is relatively flat. the red line goes up and up and up with a particular bump in 2020 and now sits above 5%. Now, 5% may not sound like a hell of a lot, and it isn't. It means that 95% of all the links are high quality, but it's still remarkably more than for Democrats, red again being Republicans. So it appears that Republicans share more misinformation in Congress than Democrats. Now, what we were interested in is to say, well, hang on, is this an American thing? Is it something about conservatism? What's going on here? Can we look elsewhere to get a comparison? And so we looked at the United Kingdom and we looked at Germany. And for both countries, we obtained all tweets by all members of parliament. They don't call it Congress, they call it parliament. And we classified it by party and by the trustworthiness or lack thereof of the information being shared. And I'm showing you the German data here. There is 6 parties shown in this graph. 5 of them you can't tell apart because they're basically at zero. They're even below Democrats in how little untrustworthy information they share. And that covers the entire political spectrum, from the conservatives to the fairly far left. The left party is actually kind of far left. There's one exception. That's the blue line. That's the far right neo-Nazi AfD. And they share a great deal more untrustworthy information. In fact, they're above the level of Republicans in the United States. But intriguingly, within the mainstream spectrum from left to right, there was no difference in the accuracy of political communication. Now, this result is kind of interesting because it sheds a new light on what I'm showing here, which is that we've always known that in the United States, among the public, conservative voters consume and share more misinformation than liberals. The graph I'm showing you here is from a paper in Science published by a whole bunch of authors, including people working for Facebook, who had access to 208 million Facebook users. In other words, everybody on Facebook in the United States was in this analysis. And what you can see is that whichever way you look at it, whatever measure you take, when it comes to misinformation, everything is focused on the far strongly conservative segment of the political spectrum. Now, this is just the latest study and the biggest study ever to show this. There's dozens of others. And there's absolutely no question that that is the case. Whichever way you measure it, it doesn't matter. Now, the reasons for this have been unclear. I'm still not sure we know the answer. But at least what we can add to that prior knowledge is that, well, it's not just the voters, it is also Republican political elites that demonstrably contribute to this, and more so than their Democratic counterpart. And now let me just take a quick moment to highlight that I'm now, and anybody else working in this area, is facing a huge dilemma. Because if we're truthful about the data, then what we have to conclude is what I just said. Misinformation, however you measure it, is largely confined to highly conservative people in the United States. There just isn't a similar counterpart on the left. You just can't find it. It's not there. It is just not there. So, of course, I'm happy to say that because I have to. I'm bound by the data and the evidence. But of course, then, unsurprisingly, perhaps, that invites a charge of political bias by the people at the receiving end of what I'm saying. Yeah, well, it's not surprising. But what I can't do is to pretend that there is political symmetry and misrepresent the data. So, and this is a real dilemma for all of us in this community. We can either be honest or we can pretend that there's political symmetry. You can't do both because there isn't any political symmetry. Fine. So we've established that there is this misinformation. It's not just Donald Trump, it's Republicans also, but it seems to be limited to the United States. It doesn't show up in the UK and Germany. But now back to the initial conundrum. How can liars be honest? How can, what's going on here? Why is it possible for somebody to say this? Well, that's easy. They're just, making stuff up. But then why is it possible that other people fall for it? Because I just showed you these pictures for a second time because they were stimuli in an experiment that was done within a few days of the inauguration. And people's only task was to click on a photo with more people in it, right? Pretty easy. You just click right or left. Well, when you look at the data, it turns out that non-voters or people who voted for Clinton never picked the wrong photo. They never said there were more people in the Trump photo. But now look at Trump voters. What you find there is a very high error rate, and it is highest among those who are highly educated. So highly educated Trump voters, a quarter of them picked the wrong photo. Now, that is not a perceptual failure. I do not believe that educated Republicans have poorer eyesight than the rest of us. No, what I think is going on is that this is something that's been called participatory propaganda, which is that people willingly engage in accepting and sharing a falsehood because it is expressing allegiance, in this case, to a leader. And that is something that Donald Trump has supported himself. He's sort of encouraging his followers not to believe anything they see or read or that they've heard. Kind of weird, because why would you do that? Well, I think the answer is that if you encourage people not to believe anything, then what's left is, my own messages, and people end up just believing whatever Donald Trump is saying. So maybe that's one reason why his supporters think that he's honest. Yeah, I think there's some component of that. But I think there's something more fundamental. And that fundamental element is, we have to understand this, is the relationship between populism and truth. What's populism? Populism is an ideology that is not tied to any particular commitments. Basically, populism sees the world as this conflict between, on the one hand, good people, real Americans, and on the other hand, bad people, the elites, the deep state, these academics. And this is an entirely artificial construction, but it is very effective for a politician, especially if it is accompanied by calls that, the will of the people has to be followed, however that's defined. And for that reason, I think it is actually antithetical to democracy, because populism doesn't recognize the plurality of legitimate opinions. It just says, oh, if you criticize us, you're part of the elite. You're bad. You're not obeying the voice of the people. Now, corollary of that ideology is this affirmation of the common sense of people against lies of the elite. It's this playing up of common sense rather than evidence. Now, myself and others, a couple other people have been working on this. We have taken this to identify two subjective conceptions of honesty. Now, what I mean by that is that these are the views people hold of what it means to be honest. On the one hand, we have something that I call populist honesty, for lack of a better term, and that relies on intuition and feelings, on common sense, authenticity. It is speaking your mind. It is belief speaking that is key to being considered honest. Donald Trump says it as it is, or he says what he feels. That is an indication of honesty that I call belief speaking. And by contrast, we have something really boring called fact speaking, which actually relies on evidence and which says, well, for you to be honest, you got to be right. You can't just tell me something that's wrong. And for me to still think of you of honest, there has to be some veracity in what you're saying. Now, those two subjective understandings of truth and honesty are kind of, opposing ends of a continuum, kind of. When I say kind of, I'm acknowledging the fact that they can actually coexist, and especially in political speech. It is very important to speak your belief in order to, contest ideas. A lot of politics is value driven and has nothing to do with evidence. So there has to be belief speaking in it. No question. I'm not saying it shouldn't be there. But what I am saying is that if all that's left is belief speaking without any recourse to reality, then you have a problem. And here are some fairly random quotations from populist figures. The first one, the other two you may not. They're British. They're right-wing personalities in Great Britain. They were quite explicit about this thing. Oh, well, fact is antiquated. There is no such thing as a fact anymore. Yeah, well, of course, if you don't acknowledge facts, if you just lie all the time, then you could say that. Then facts are gone. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing. And the reason it's not a good thing is because there's quite a bit of work in political theory that is identifying the importance of shared knowledge for a democracy. You can't have a democracy unless there's a shared body of knowledge. And this populist conception of truth, I would argue, undermines that common knowledge because it shifts the balance from fact speaking and belief speaking way over towards belief speaking. And I think that is potentially problematic. All right, so that was a lot of sort of philosophy and theory and conceptual stuff. So let's try and go back to the data. Can we identify these different conceptions of truth or honesty in political speech? Well, yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking to you. We can do it. Let me tell you how we did it. I'm going to zip through this a little because it's sort of technical and I don't think we need all the technical details. But the bottom line is that we ended up with dictionaries for belief speaking and fact speaking. There's a bunch of items in each. Here's a sample of the items that we think are quintessentially belief speaking. Things like consider, envisage, feel. Fact speaking, by contrast, is about determining, evaluating, evidence, examine. You sort of get the picture. There's different ways of approaching belief formation and honesty, and they're captured by these dictionaries. Now, this is where it gets to be geeky, and it's a lot of fun. So let me take you through it anyway, even though it takes a little bit of time. But the problem with having dictionaries is that you now have to identify speech that is characterized by one or the other of those dictionaries. Well, if you just count the words that are in text, that's very coarse. That doesn't tell you terribly much. And what if you have something that, miraculously avoids every single word in your dictionary, but you still get the sense it's expressing belief rather than facts? How do you cope with that? Well, the answer is that you take the dictionaries and convert them into embeddings. What are embeddings? Well, embeddings are numeric representations of words, vectors of 300 numbers that represent a word based on an analysis of the entire English language. So Now, we didn't do this. Other people have done it before, so you can download this. If you crawl the web and you download 840 billion tokens, then it turns out you end up with 2.2 million words, quote unquote. Now, a lot of those words are not words. They're kind of exclamations, names, abbreviations and all sorts of stuff. But nonetheless, you have 2.2 million different strings in this corpus of, well, the entire internet, so to speak. And what you then do is you create a co-occurrence matrix of these 2.2 million words. What the hell does that mean? Well, it simply means how many times one word follows another. To illustrate, I have a bit of Dr. Seuss here. And, you can see that cat followed the 3 times. Cat was followed by sat twice. You can sort of get the picture. It's a co-occurrence matrix. Now imagine having that with 2.2 million rows and 2.2 million columns to describe the English language. Well, that's a hell of a lot of information and very unwieldy. So what do? Well, you do some mathematical wizardry and you collapse this huge co-occurrence matrix. You just squash it down mathematically, reduce the dimensions until each row represents a word through only 300 numbers. But those 300 numbers capture the meaning of that word based on what else it co-occurred with. So now all of a sudden we have something manageable. We have 300 numbers for each word, each of these 2.2 million, but that's kind of manageable. And what we can now do is we can play with these numbers. We can do subtraction. You can take the word for Berlin, 300 numbers, subtract from that Germany. What do you get? Well, you get some random stuff, numbers. Well, then you can do the same for Paris and France, and you get another random thing. But guess what? Those 2 random strings are highly similar because they capture the relationship between a country and its capital. And then you can do fun things like rearrange the equation, and you can do word equations based on those numbers. And this, actually works very well. And what it buys you, and this is crucial, what it buys you is that we can compute an average embedding for our dictionaries, an average embedding at whatever text that we're examining, in this case, tweets, as I'll explain in a moment. And you can then compute the similarity between those 2 average embeddings. So all of a sudden, it no longer matters whether a particular keyword has appeared in a string of text or not, because you've replaced it with the meaning of the average meaning of the dictionary. Now, we validated our dictionaries by applying them to a corpus of nearly 1 million New York Times articles going back to the 19th century. And guess what? In the science section, fact speaking is highest, higher than in politics and opinion. And conversely, belief speaking is highest in opinion and lower in the other 2 sections. Well, as you would expect, wouldn't you? And that was one, and we've done many other, experiments and things, asked people about this, but, we have a pretty good sense that our dictionaries are capturing what we are wanting to capture. And now back to the tweets you've already seen briefly. The tweets of all the members of US Congress, but now instead of looking at the accuracy of the links in there, we look at the belief speaking or fact speaking in those tweets. And here's just an example of, well, you guess, is it belief speaking or fact speaking? Oh, that's belief speaking. And here we have another tweet. What do you think that is? Yes, that's fact speaking. And even without knowing the dictionaries or counting the words, I think it's very powerful. The distinction is captured in this text. Whoever tweeted this thing on the right is talking about evidence. Whoever tweeted the thing on the left is has a lot of belief. Let's put it that way. So Oh, by the way, the question in the chat about how can the two be identical for science? The comparison between the columns cannot be done. The only thing that matters is rank ordering within each column. So, yeah, well spotted, but not relevant. It's a completely different scale. So we can identify belief speaking and fact speaking in these public speech by members of Congress. Can we link those to different outcomes? Now, let me be perfectly clear here that what I've done so far is talked about rhetoric, about conceptions of honesty. How do people talk about honesty? How do they try to express belief or fact speaking? That's rhetoric, okay? By itself, that does not tell us anything about the accuracy of the information. However, we can venture a guess that maybe fact speaking is more conducive to conveying accurate information, and belief speaking, yeah, maybe that is more conducive to misinformation. But it's critical to understand that so far we haven't linked the two. All we've done is to identify these different types of rhetoric. But now let's link them and see what happens. Here are the key data from that analysis of congressional speech. Let me first talk about fact speaking on the right. What you're seeing here is the degree to which each tweet, each tiny little dot here now is one of those 1.6 million tweets, how that the extent of fact speaking in that tweet relates to the quality of a link being shared in that tweet. This is again using NewsGuard, and it's a very easy graph to interpret because the more you go to the right, the higher the quality of the information being shared. That's true for both Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, when Republicans are very much in fact-speaking mode, they no longer differ that much from Democrats. They're converging. That's the top panel. The bottom panel shows the same pattern, but the text we're analyzing is not the tweets. It's the articles that were shared in a tweet. And you find the same pattern. So meaning that the more fact-speaking a tweet is, the more likely it is that they're sharing an article, linking to an article that is in turn fact-speaking as well. And that has a positive effect on accuracy because things go up on the NewsGuard ranking. All right, now what about belief speaking? Very different pattern. That's where party all of a sudden matters. The more belief speaking is expressed by Republicans, the lower the quality of the information they're sharing. The blue line in the top panel is virtually flat, but there's just a minuscule effects of this on Democrats as well. And if you look at the target of what is being shared, then the bottom falls out, which is that for Republicans, you get this incredible decline that the more they link to an article that is belief speaking itself, the more likely it is that that article came from a very low quality source. So what do we conclude? Well, we're suggesting in this sample at least that belief speaking is a gateway to sharing of misinformation. Now, primarily, it's only Republicans that avail themselves of that opportunity because Democrats just don't do it that much. But it is nonetheless interesting that even for Republicans, they don't share bad quality information unless they're belief speaking, unless they're not concerned with facts in their language, but are concerned with belief. All right, so that's the first kind of major take-home message. Now, I do have a few more minutes left, I think. So I now want to tell you about the flow-on effects. That is, what happens to the public when they're exposed to that different type of communication. This is where it becomes really neat because Twitter permits conversations. The public can reply to politicians. You can have something like that. You can have a politician who is seeding, the word is important, just so we understand what's happening, who is seeding a conversation by saying something. And then the public can reply. We looked at about 100,000 replies to 10,000 seeds, split evenly between parties. We only looked at the first reply by each replier because otherwise you can't be sure they're still replying to the initial tweet. Sometimes the thread, they reply to each other and it all becomes totally chaotic. But the first reply, we assume, is addressing the politician in the thread, the seed. So the question we can now ask is, what happens to the conversation overall depending on what the politician is seeding it with? Okay? And by the way, for the sake of terminology, politicians have a party, right? They're either one or the other. Repliers, well, we don't know. They don't have a party that we know of. But there are algorithms that allow us to infer their ideology from somewhere on the left to somewhere on the right, based on the pattern of who they follow and so on. So we have a pretty good, excuse me, statistical way of classifying the replies as well, but it's not as binary and as explicit as for the politician. So, question, how do people respond to these different types of honesty? Well, one possibility is that there's contagion. That's observed quite a bit on the internet, that you start out with something and whoever is reading this falls in line with this. There's contagion. So if that's the case, then you would have belief speaking begetting belief speaking and fact speaking being followed by fact speaking and so forth. It's one possibility. The other possibility is reactance, which is that people say, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't belief speak me. No, 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 sir. I'm going to be fact speaking and reply. So could be one or the other. Well, could also be nothing, But that is what we set out to disentangle. We're also looking, this is a new measure we're drawing on now, and that is polarization. And there's evidence that polarized dialogue in politics is dominated by emotion. So that is kind of hinting at the possibility that, belief speaking might lead to more polarization. And conversely, possibly, fact speaking might lead to depolarization. Okay, so that's what we set out to examine. I'll skip over the ideology stuff. That's a detail that's not terribly relevant. But here's the key result. And the answer is there's contagion. Let me walk you through the graph. We have the two parties. So the politicians from two parties, Democrat on the left, Republican on the right. And within each panel, we are plotting the extent to which the seed tweet is belief speaking, that's on the left, or fact speaking, that's on the right. And what we're plotting as a function of that is the extent to which the reply is either belief speaking or fact speaking. And what you can see is that there's a very strong relationship. So whatever the politician is saying, that's how people respond. Now, one potential confound here is, of course, it's possible that people just follow each other the way they like it. So in other words, the repliers to a belief-speaking Republican may themselves be belief-speaking Republicans, and they follow this person because they love this stuff, okay? In which case, that would be less interesting because it just shows that people of a like-minded style clustered together online. Well, we can identify that possibility by considering the same dyads, but with different seeds. What do I mean by that? The same politician can talk differently on different occasions. And the same replier may reply on those different occasions. And when that happens, then you got the same couple, the same persons involved, the same dyads. And you can now ask, is there still contagion within these dyads? In other words, does a person change their style when the politician is seeding the conversation differently? The answer is yes. The replies are more fact-speaking when the seed was fact-speaking, and they are more belief-speaking when the seed of the conversation was belief-speaking. The difference between these two box plots is statistically significant. It's a tiny effect, but it's statistically significant. And it's the same people in both. Same politicians, same repliers. So we've ruled out this homophily idea that people just cluster together. Well, maybe they do that too, but even if the same two people are involved in two different conversations under two different circumstances, the contagion effect is present in both. Okay, last few slides, one or two slides. What about affective polarization? Well, guess what? We have a dictionary for that as well. And we use the same embedding and the same averaging and the same similarity measures. The text on the left is, you can guess, it's not polarizing, surprisingly. The one on the right, on the other hand, is highly polarizing. We know that from application of the dictionaries, and this is just to illustrate what we pick out with what's polarizing versus what's not. So, how does belief speaking versus fact speaking affect polarization in the replies? Well, the answer is exactly as we had vaguely anticipated. The more fact-speaking a politician is when they initiate a conversation, the less the replies are polarized. That effect is stronger for Democrats than Republicans, but it's present for both parties. So you want to depolarize conversations online? Very easy. Get the politicians to talk about evidence and facts and not engage in belief speaking. Now, the remarkable thing here in both of these contagion effects is that it underscores the importance of political leadership. That, it's not that there's nothing we can do. Oh, the politicians could do something. Let me tell you, they could change their conversational style. And all the data we have, and lots of other data, by the way, suggests that that would make a huge difference to the public's polarization and susceptibility to misinformation, and so on and so on. So let me revisit what I started out with at the beginning, this conundrum, right? Lots of lies, but perceived honesty. Why? Is there anything we can now say about this conundrum? Well, I think we can. I think we can at least speculate with some, modest confidence that this may have happened because belief speaking has replaced fact speaking as a marker of honesty. That it is more important to people, certain people, that a politician is expressing their beliefs sincerely than that they're accurate about the real world. If you accept that, and our data seem to suggest that, then that is how we can explain why belief speaking is a gateway to misinformation, because if the politicians know this, well, then they're not going to lose any perceived honesty when they're sharing misinformation, provided they do so in a context where, hey, I'm expressing my belief. And that means I can say anything and get away with it. What I haven't answered yet is whether belief speaking is considered honest, even if it's inaccurate. Actually, I know the answer, but I haven't published it yet, and I don't have time to get into it. I'm out of time, so I'll skip over that and say thank you for your attention. And I hope you still have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewandowski. This is so intriguing, and the ways you have assessed and characterized the rhetoric quantitatively, it is very, very innovative, and I'm sure it opens doors for so many newer studies and innovations that are waiting to happen. So thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
your time. I've been watching the chat and it is just running like a curtain. So we have a lot of interaction on the chat, but let me open the floor by asking you a question about now, since we know how to characterize the rhetoric, and we have seen from your research that often belief speaking rhetoric is the gateway of misinformation. We also know that many times conspiracy theorists, when presented with facts, they tend to get more entrenched in their beliefs. So, given these two, your research findings and these other studies, how do we propose solutions to mitigate this problem? We are heading into an election year globally,
Yes.
so we are
Yes.
going to face a lot of this.
Right. Well, okay. I I think the one obvious answer is in my data, which is that, if politicians stopped lying and polarizing people, then we wouldn't have this problem. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that that's, not going to give us much of leverage given the current political economy. But it's important to remind us of that the problem here is not people, not the population necessarily. It's politicians that are vectors of disinformation. So that's one answer. The other answer is when you say conspiracy theorists are impervious to facts. Well, sort of some of them, but actually, if you look at the data, quite a few of them are susceptible to corrections, as people are generally. So it's not that people are, unable to update their memories at all. That's not the case. The problem is more than people not updating their memory. The problem is that they do update their memory, but it doesn't matter. That is what we found in a number of studies, that yes, you can correct people's misconceptions and they then say, oh gosh, yeah, right, that was wrong. Then you ask them, do you like Donald Trump? And they say, yeah, sure. There's no correlation between the extent to which they move on a fact-based issue and how they feel about a politician. That's true for Bernie Sanders supporters as well, by the way. We've looked at it both ways. And how do you deal with that? Well, I don't know, to be honest. We have a lot of interventions that make small differences, like inoculation, for example, debunking, all of this stuff works. But we're talking not about silver bullets, but kind of silver buckshot. We have these little pellets that do a little bit. But to solve the problem needs a change in the political culture, and that means the politicians themselves have to realize that they shouldn't do this. And that's wishful thinking. I know that.
Well, stranger things have happened, so who knows? Well,
Indeed.
thank you for the response, and I know we have just a few more minutes, so I would like to go over the chat and see. So we have a question from Ben Town. Ben, would you like to open your microphone and ask your question?
My voice is pretty gone, so the chat's probably better.
Okay.
Oh, well, let me answer the first question there. No, that's not a way out because what's his name? Spicer was very clear of this being in-person attendance. So yeah, you could escape to online and all, but that wasn't what he claimed.
Thanks.
Right. And we have also a question from Billy. I believe, Billy, your question is along the similar lines.
Yeah, more about the methodology, I guess, computational methodology. And when you take something like that picture and then the statement, it would seem to be based on the dictionary, possibly that it was fact, would you say fact speaking versus belief? And then since it wasn't an article being shared, how would that be evaluated, I guess? Because there's a lot of pictures and videos shared.
Okay, I need a bit of clarification here. When you say the picture, what are you talking about? Are you still talking about the inauguration photos?
Yeah.
Oh, they have nothing to do with belief speaking or fact speaking. The inauguration photos were a separate study done years earlier, and they just dealt with how do people interpret those photos. And by the way, I ran a follow-up study on that a couple of years later, and we no longer found that effect using the same panel of participants. Ran the study in the United States, presented them with the same photo, and that effect was completely gone, which doesn't surprise me at all because, which in fact confirms what I thought was going on, and that is that at the time when this was a big political issue, Trump supporters were expressing their support by picking a picture they very well knew was the wrong answer. And then 3 years later that they had completely forgotten about it. It was no longer political. There was no one talked about it. All of a sudden they saw these two photos, and so yeah, they clicked the one they knew had more people in it. So this was a very much in the moment phenomenon. I think these things come and go depending on the currency of the day. If it's controversial for 2 days, that's when you get the effect. A week later, it's gone. And something else pops up. It's just a very volatile situation.
Okay.
Thank
I guess if it was shared online or if it had been tweeted or something, would it have been again really about the methodology and kind of the classification, dictionary based? Would it be?
That's an interesting question. Would the photo, well, I mean, the simple, straightforward answer is that we do not classify photos. We do not, our dictionaries tell us nothing about pictures.
Right.
And that's you're making a very interesting point because, of course, pictures can have a major effect, or videos. If people share pictures of videos in a tweet, they can be very influential. We would not pick that up one way or the other, not at all. No, we only look at text.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that presents more opportunities for future research. And with that, I also would like to thank Professor Lewandowski again for being with us. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Professor Lewandowski directly. This will be the end of our monthly social cybersecurity working group meeting. Next week, we will be back with another very distinctive speaker. So thank you, all of you, and thank you,
Thank you.
Lewandowski.
Okay, thanks very much.